What if the most dangerous confession in Washington didn't come from a witness under oath, but from a man who didn't know he was being recorded, whispering at 4:12 a.m. that the system already had an escape plan? And when Jaime Raskin pressed play, Stephen Miller didn't just face questions. He faced his own voice promising a pardon before any crime was exposed. And what followed was 395 seconds of silence that may have revealed more than any answer ever could. If you're new here, hit subscribe now, because what you're about to see isn't a hearing. It's a moment where the line between power and accountability starts to fracture in real time. This is not a normal congressional hearing. It is a controlled detonation, a prosecutorial setup disguised as oversight. And from the very first second, the outcome was never meant to be a clarification. It was meant to be an exposure. The room that morning didn't feel like a policy briefing. It felt like a courtroom waiting for evidence to be admitted. And the difference matters, because in a courtroom, every word is measured against consequence, not optics. Here's the first reality you need to understand. When a lawmaker walks in without documents, without binders, carrying only a small recording device, that is not preparation. It is intention. Jaime Raskin didn't come to debate immigration statistics. He came to introduce something into the record that couldn't be walked back, reframed, or buried in committee language. And when he spoke, there was no theatrics, no raised voice, just a single statement that shifted the entire gravity of the room. This recording was obtained through lawful subpoena. That line alone changes everything. Because it tells you this isn't rumor, it isn't a leak. It is evidence already filtered through legal thresholds, already validated before it ever reached the microphone. And when Stephen Miller responded, carefully invoking executive privilege and attorney-client protections, what he was really doing was building a legal shield before the first blow had even landed. But here's the problem, and this is where the logic begins to tighten. Privilege protects advice. It does not protect intent. It does not protect coordination. And it absolutely does not protect conversations that suggest a crime is already anticipated. That's not interpretation. That's doctrine. That's where oversight turns into exposure. Then the audio plays, and in that moment, everything stops being theoretical, because hearing a sentence is different from being told about it. Hearing tone, hesitation, certainty, that's where meaning lives. When Stephen Miller says, "If this comes out, we are finished," that's not policy language, that's not strategy, that's risk assessment spoken in plain terms. And when the conversation shifts to containment, to classified reports, to controlling who knows what and when, the picture sharpens into something far more structured than a mistake. Now step back for a second and think about what this means outside that room. Because this isn't just about one conversation, it's about the architecture behind it. If a system exists where information can be compartmentalized, where documentation can be reclassified, where witnesses can be repositioned before they speak, then the real question isn't what happened. It's how many layers were designed to make sure it never surfaces. And that's where the moral line begins to appear. Because the average person watching this doesn't operate inside classified channels or legal privilege. They operate in a system where rules are supposed to be consistent. So when they hear that someone inside that system is already discussing protection before exposure, the question becomes unavoidable. Is the law a boundary, or is it just another tool depending on who's holding it? And then the conversation reaches the line, the one sentence that doesn't just raise suspicion, it collapses the entire defense structure in real time. When Stephen Miller says, "He'll pardon us if we get caught," the hearing doesn't escalate, it transforms. Because that is no longer a discussion about policy or even about risk. That is a statement that assumes three things already exist: an action worth prosecuting, an awareness that it could be exposed, and a prearranged mechanism to escape consequences. This is where the second layer of logic locks in, and it's not emotional, it's structural. A pardon, by definition, comes after a crime. It is reactive. It is a legal response to an established violation. But what you just heard flips that sequence completely. It places the pardon before the exposure, before the charge, before the public even knows something has happened. That's not how the system is designed to work. That's how a system gets bent. And this is exactly where Jaime Raskin moves into full prosecutorial mode, not by raising his voice, but by tightening the timeline. April 3rd, 4:12 a.m. The call. April 7th. The grand jury is impaneled. April 9th. One witness is transferred out of position. April 11th. Another is placed on leave. April 14th. The Treasury report is suddenly classified under national security. Each date by itself could be explained away. Together, they stop looking like coincidence and start looking like coordination. This is what evidence stacking actually feels like in real time. It's not dramatic music or emotional speeches. It's a sequence of events that align too cleanly to ignore. And once that alignment is visible, every action that follows stops being neutral. It becomes part of a pattern. Now here's the deeper implication. The part most people miss when they focus only on the headline. Because this isn't just about what was said on that call. It's about what happened after the call, and whether those actions reflect exactly what was discussed. If a conversation includes plans to contain information, and then within days, documents are locked down, witnesses are moved, and reports are reclassified, then the conversation is no longer hypothetical. It becomes predictive. And that changes the entire legal posture. Because now you're not asking whether someone did something wrong. You're asking whether they anticipated it, prepared for it, and executed steps to protect it before anyone else could see it. That's not negligence, that's design. From a citizen's perspective, this is where the discomfort becomes real. Because the system is supposed to operate in reverse. Investigation first, then evidence, then consequence. But what you're watching here suggests a different sequence: action, concealment, and only then, if necessary, accountability. And if that sequence holds, then the law isn't acting as a safeguard. It's acting as a delayed reaction. Back in the room, Stephen Miller doesn't argue this logic. He doesn't dismantle the timeline. He doesn't offer an alternative explanation for why each event aligns so precisely with what was said at 4:12 a.m. Instead, his legal team moves to the only defense still available: silence. The Fifth Amendment is invoked, not to clarify, but to contain. And here's the critical point. Invoking the Fifth doesn't erase the evidence. It acknowledges the risk of speaking against it. It tells you that whatever explanation exists carries its own potential consequences. And when that silence stretches, not for seconds, but for minutes, it stops being a pause. It becomes a statement. And this is where silence stops being absence and starts becoming evidence in its own right. Because 395 seconds is not hesitation. It is not confusion. It is not someone searching for the right phrasing. It is a duration long enough for a denial, long enough for a clarification, long enough for even a partial explanation that could introduce doubt. But none of that happens. Stephen Miller sits there, hands pressed flat, jaw tightening, and in that stillness, the burden of proof doesn't disappear. It concentrates. Here's the third layer of logic. And it's the one that turns this from a political moment into a legal one. In any investigative setting, especially under oath, there are only a limited number of responses available when confronted with direct evidence. You refute it, you contextualize it, or you invoke your right not to respond. Each of those choices carries meaning. But when the question is as specific as, "Who is he?" and the answer is nothing, not even a denial, that absence creates a vacuum that the evidence rushes in to fill. And Jaime Raskin understands that completely. He doesn't need to push harder. He doesn't need theatrics. Because the structure is already complete. You have the audio. You have the timeline. You have the actions that follow. And now you have the silence. That's not 4 separate elements. That's one continuous chain. Now step outside the chamber again, because this is where the stakes widen. Imagine you are not a lawmaker, not a lawyer, just someone watching this unfold in real time. What are you supposed to take from this? That a senior official discussed protection before exposure, that actions taken days later align with that discussion, and that when asked directly, there is no explanation offered. The question that starts forming isn't legal, it's existential. If this is how the system behaves at the highest level, what does accountability actually look like for everyone else? Because accountability, in theory, is supposed to be equal. It is supposed to function the same whether you are a contractor, a staffer, or someone inside the executive branch. But what you're seeing here suggests a different architecture, one where proximity to power changes the sequence, changes the timing, and potentially changes the outcome. And if that's true, then the issue isn't just misconduct. It's asymmetry. And that asymmetry has consequences far beyond one hearing. It shapes how people interact with the law itself. If citizens begin to believe that consequences can be negotiated in advance, that protection can be discussed before wrongdoing is even exposed, then the law stops being a deterrent. It becomes a calculation. It becomes something you factor in, not something you fear. Back in the room, the pattern becomes even harder to ignore. 17 calls, all between midnight and 5 a.m., all clustered around key financial movements and administrative decisions. That is not random behavior. That is not coincidence stretched thin. That is coordination operating on a schedule designed to avoid visibility. And when those calls line up with wire transfers, classification orders, and personnel changes, the narrative stops being speculative. It becomes logistical. And this is the moment where the meaning shifts again. Because now the question is no longer, did something happen? The evidence has already answered that. The question becomes, how far does it go? Who else was on those calls? Who else benefited from those decisions? And more importantly, who else understood that if it ever surfaced, there was already a plan in place to make it disappear? And this is where the story stops being about a man in a chair and starts becoming about a system under stress. Because when the words, "He'll pardon us if we get caught," are no longer hypothetical but supported by a chain of actions, the question isn't whether something inappropriate was said. It's whether the boundaries of law were quietly rewritten in practice while still appearing intact on paper. This is the final layer of the structure, and it is the most dangerous one. When power doesn't just break rules, but builds a process around surviving the consequences of breaking them. Because look at what's already established: discussion of exposure, discussion of containment, anticipation of charges, and then a preloaded outcome. That's not panic. That's planning. And when planning reaches that level, the line between governance and protection racket starts to blur in a way that should concern anyone watching, regardless of party. Jaime Raskin doesn't need to prove the entire conspiracy in that room. He doesn't need to name every participant or trace every dollar. What he does is more precise and more devastating. He demonstrates that the sequence exists, that intent was spoken, that actions followed. and that when confronted, the person at the center of it all chose silence over explanation. That's not a full verdict, but it is enough to shift the burden permanently. And here's the moral scene, the part that doesn't sit in transcripts or legal filings, but lives in consequence. Because while those calls were happening at 4:12 in the morning, while documents were being classified and witnesses were being moved, the people outside that system were still playing by the rules. Contractors who follow compliance procedures. Employees who assume oversight bodies function as intended. Citizens who believe that if something crosses a legal line, there will be a process that corrects it. That belief is the foundation. And moments like this crack it. Because if the law can be anticipated, contained, and pre-negotiated at the highest levels, then what is it for everyone else? Is it a boundary, or just a guideline that depends on your position? That's not a partisan question. That's a structural one. And it's the kind of question that doesn't go away when the hearing ends. It follows the system long after the cameras are turned off. Now return to that silence. 395 seconds. Long enough for a denial that never came. Long enough for a defense that was never attempted. Long enough for every person in that room, and every person watching, to understand that whatever explanation exists, it was either too risky or too revealing to say out loud. Silence in that moment wasn't protection. It was confirmation of the stakes. So here is the question that remains, and it is not rhetorical. It is unavoidable. If someone inside the system can discuss protection before exposure, coordinate actions after that discussion, and then refuse to answer when confronted with both, what exactly is left of accountability? And more importantly, who decides when the law applies and when it waits? If you made it this far, you already understand this isn't just another hearing breakdown. This is a moment that forces a line to be drawn. So hit like, leave your perspective below, share this with someone who needs to see it clearly, and subscribe, because the next release isn't speculation, it's the continuation of the record. And once you see what comes next, that 4:12 a.m. call may not even be the most revealing part of the story.